This is the NRNRC Black Table Talk Podcast. Hello, everybody. Happy Hump Day. It is now May 15th, and we're here at high noon, and we have a very special guest with us. Very decorated, if I must say myself, and he's also a friend of the office. And before we do so and get into his background and his career, I am your host, Travis Register, and my co-host name is
Foster Sellers.
and our special guest. Say your name.
It's Jason Ziedenberg,
Hey,
Director of Research and Publications with the DC Justice Lab.
Oh, you got a good radio voice, Jason.
I was practicing all morning.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I have been working with Patrice Sultan as a Director of Research and Publications for the DC Justice Lab for a little over a year now. And my job within the organization is to take the massive amounts of information that are generated by all of our staff, a lot of it research-based, and try to get it into documents, get into useful materials that then can be used for advocacy, for organizing, and to help the organization have further reach.
Wow.
That's basically what I do for the DC Justice Lab. I'd encourage your listeners to visit the DC Justice Lab library, where we have research on a variety of topics as it relates to policing, punishment, prosecution, and we're going to have a new section on prevention, which hopefully we'll touch on a little bit today. And you can learn much more about how to make DC safer, freer, and more equal.
I've been seeing a lot of posts you've been putting on reels, if you will, on Instagram. You all, I like to call y'all. Y'all like my best friends. Just like y'all the DC Justice League. Just super friends. Y'all always out
Super
there
friends.
with boots to the ground.
Right.
Always advocating. Always
Yes.
pushing for legislation and things of that manner. So and that's needed. And I see y'all as a force. So for you to be here, and I like information / numbers cruncher for everything that's going on in there. It's like falls on your shoulders. If you don't put it together, it might fall apart.
I work with a very strong team of policy experts and attorneys who are literally reshaping the agenda for Washington, D.C. It's a very privilege to play a small role with them.
So humble, small role, huh? Yeah, okay. So how long you been in legal practice?
So I am not an attorney,
Okay.
but I have worked in criminal justice reform for about 23 years now. I came to this movement through an organization called the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice, which at the time was one of the only direct service organizations trying to help people coming out of facilities, mainly young people, get back into their homes, stay out of the justice system, and to stay in school and get the services they need. That organization started a policy division, which is called the Justice Policy Institute. That name is now very well known in Washington, D.C. But at the time Vincent Schiraldi established the Justice Policy Institute, there were no organizations like the DC Justice Lab. There were no organizations like the National Reentry Network with podcasts. It's a much, much smaller field. And basically, I worked there for a good part of my career. Also worked with the DC Department of Youth Rehabilitative Services as their research officer. Also worked for an organization called the Alliance for Safety and Justice. That we're going to talk a little bit about the research done there for a minute.
Okay.
Also worked as a consultant to a lot of different justice agencies in D.C., groups like the U.S. Justice Department's National Institute of Corrections, which focuses on probation and parole, as well as the Bureau of Justice Assistance, which is responsible for pushing out a lot of the federal money that we do see in law enforcement and in reentry. So I've sort of had a chance to sort of be in nonprofits, be in government, be working for advocacy groups, working for activist groups around this issue for about 23 years. Last thing I'll say, we talked at the beginning about, tell us about yourself.
Yeah.
Do like to always say that along with being a very long time DC resident, I've owned a house in DC right up the street from our offices for about 11 years. I also am from Toronto, Canada, spending a
Oh,
lot of
okay.
time up there,
okay.
and spent time working in the justice system advocacy space in Oregon, Portland, Oregon, California, in Northern California,
Wow.
as well as New York State. So I have a little bit, and Maryland. So I have a little bit of a multi-state perspective that I bring to our DC work that we're all trying to do together.
That's awesome, Jason. I just want to say hats off to you for your continued commitment in this reentry space, and we appreciate all that you've had to offer over the years. That's amazing.
I'm glad we have solved all of our problems, which we'll get into now.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So you I mean, I'm sitting here now and I'm listening to you speak about all the things you've been involved in and you are involved in, and it's like you're almost saying, or what you was doing, like a piece to the puzzle, being with the children and being in the criminal justice space on the other side, on the advocacy side, as well. You know, pushing for different policies and things of that manner, and to where now I call you numbers and information cruncher. Because you compile so much and then put them in the documents, things of that manner. But you've been doing a lot of things, and that has to be a very valuable. You have to be a very valuable piece to what you bring to an organization because you have a lot of experience.
The one thing that I would want to leave people with is that research and data and having sound facts is important. It is important. It was important in this movement to be able to prove, yes, we can run reentry programs, we can get people employment, peer support, we can get them housing, and they won't commit more crimes. Like for a while, we did actually as a movement have to prove that. In 2024, I think more of our job is taking all the massive amounts of information that show what we need to be doing and find the right way to make it a political tool that people can find their peace on. So I just think that's where we're at in 2024. And one of the reasons why I wanted an opportunity to talk about the safety gaps work is to compare that to the discussion we've been having in DC around crime rates.
So yeah, you said you used to work for the Alliance for Safety and Justice, and they just came out with a report. So I've read the report, and one of the things I wanted to put into some context for our listeners is what are the safety gaps? What is this pattern of the cycle of crime, and where do we go from here? I know the report talked about different touch points as far as reentry programs, mental health, victim services, as well as intervention, prevention for violence. So that's basically what the 4 categories were that they were talking about and how we can bring this to scale. But if you could touch on a little bit of those questions and kind of give our listeners some context to what we're talking about today.
Sure. One step back first.
Okay.
I think it's important to get to that point, which is the debate in D.C. The past year or two has been a lot about crime rates, a lot about the issues that we ended 2023 with the highest homicide count that we'd had in 20 years. And in particular, at least in the spaces that I'm in, a lot of discussion about carjackings and different kinds of behavior that feel very personal and bring a lot of personal fear. So those are crime trends that we've talked about in DC. Safety gaps, which is held up in scaling safety, is a different concept that was developed by somebody named Lenore Anderson, who is the president of the Alliance for Safety and Justice, whom I had the chance to work with for about 5 years. Lenore's approach to this, which she also wrote in her book, was basically the idea that most people, when you hear about crime rates and you hear about crime trends, you don't get the fact that most of what happens to people around violence and crime is never reported to the police. So it's never part of our discussion about, do people feel safe?
Right.
Other statistics that really are important to consider when thinking about this, which is what we would call the safety gap. Those things that show the difference between what would help a person feel safe and their lack of safety. That is generally the concept of what a safety gap is. 73% of crime survivors didn't get mental health treatment or counseling after the crime. Like that one to me is one of the more powerful safety gap figures. Another one, Travis, that you mentioned early on, that 1 year out of prison, something like 80% of people that have come out make $15,000 or less.
Right.
That's crazy.
What do these two numbers represent in terms of just the concept of safety gap? It's that idea that, well, if I wanted to be safer, I would be doing something about the fact that 600,000 people come out of prison and jails every year.
Right.
We've got to do something about the issues that lead to this figure of they make only about $15,000 or less. And that particular statistic is one thing that's masked in there is there's something like 50% of those people that had no income.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, so this is what a safety gap is. Scaling safety was the report that Lenore Anderson, the president of the Alliance for Safety and Justice, dreamed up as a way of just reminding people in this time that we're going to be navigating around, very intense debates around crime, that we also have these massive safety gaps that we've done very little to fill all around the country. Basically, what this report does is it breaks out 4 different types of gaps that exist that are the core to people feeling less safe. One is that crime survivors very rarely get the help, services, and they need after the crime. That's one. Number 2, that we have a huge problem in this country of people that have a mental health issue or a substance use issue that just have not been addressed. And that second one is a core driver of what any person living in our city or any other city would feel every day when they encounter somebody who's in a crisis. Number 3, the idea of violence interruption and community-based violence intervention. That would be trying to wrap support and services around somebody who, because of a bunch of different things that we know, is at risk of being a victim of a violent crime or perhaps even committing a violent crime. And then lastly, reentry, which was the broad bucket of when you're coming out of prison, you need to have access to a job, housing, and sometimes treatment. Sometimes not. But those were those 2 ones at the very beginning, jobs and housing. Report basically lays out, here are the leading statistics around what each community really needs around these 4 buckets. So it lays out, I'm not going to go through every number there.
Right.
I think, but it lays out basically per 100,000 residents, you need at least 15 violence interrupters. These people need to be paid a living wage. They need to have access to health benefits so they don't just immediately go from this job to another one. And they need to be working in communities to help bring down violence. And the same thing around reentry. For every 100,000 people in a community, you need something like 100 supportive housing beds that are available to someone for at least 6 months. And then also 200 slots for someone to be able to get intensive employment assistance. In terms of what crime survivors need, the most important thing that they need is they need a place to go that is not simply the victim's compensation office, which generally you're just given a form and say, fill this out and we'll get back to you in a year. What this report calls for is the establishment of something called trauma recovery centers.
I've seen that.
Where if you're a crime survivor, you could walk in there and get all the support and services you need until you are healthy and ready to move on from the incident, and you feel as healed as you can.
Different from a wraparound service.
There are similarities to that. Like the word wraparound is a very generic term. I consider what the National Reentry Network does to be a version of wraparound. But the trauma recovery centers are absolutely a wraparound approach to meeting the needs of a crime victim.
Just a longer period of time.
Longer period of time.
Yeah.
So it was Lenore's vision that we need to just run some estimates, put some numbers out there, and sort of have this debate. Do you have 25 violence interrupters per 100,000? Okay, if you don't, what are you, City X, doing about that? What are your figures for how many violence interrupters we need? And the same thing around reentry programming. These estimates were based off of national figures, but allows us to have a conversation here in D.C. around, well, how supportive employment programs are there to help someone get ready for the jobs that exist in this region. That is basically the essence of what the Scaling Safety Project was. Since then, President Lenore Anderson of the Alliance for Safety and Justice is actually running a whole scaling safety initiative where she's going around to different communities and saying, well, let's look at some of your data. Here are some models. Could we be doing more of X, Y, or Z?
I think here in D.C., one of the things I was reading in the report, I think, is that the constituents were saying that these types of programs and how do we bring the safety gap to scale, how do we scale these programs based on those 4 categories was important, because they were saying that to invest in prisons isn't really the answer. And to what we're talking about now, as far as making that point even clearer here in D.C., we'd be surprised about all the data that we could research on nationally that says these types of programs brought to capacity or brought to scale will benefit a community in terms of reentry. And the report touched on that in the beginning to kind of lay the groundwork for where they were going with the argument, as opposed to, people pushing back and saying that, the way we've been doing things traditionally, just locking people up without considering how we could really close the safety gap, would still be okay. But we could have a different conversation now based on the report and saying that we have data nationally that says these types of programs brought to scale can have a tremendous impact on reentry.
That's right. I do think that this report is helpful to have that conversation with policymakers. What may come back is, well, we have more than 25 violent interrupters per 100,000 based off of this model. And then the next question would be, I want to know more about who is being recruited to these positions, where are they working, what level of support are they receiving, and in particular, there's been a big push by groups like Peace for DC to basically say, unless we're providing the violence interrupters with all the technological tools that they need, unless we are showing them places where they can bring people for assistance, then that role doesn't work. So if you remember from the report, there was the estimate of the number of violence interrupters. There was also, and we also need programs like after-school programs where young people, young adults can be taken to. And they need to be open all the time.
Right.
So it's these individual numbers in this report were a launching pad for a discussion.
I know here at the NRC, we are doing a program, and I ain't gonna say a program, but it's an outreach called the CLPM, and it's the Community-Led Preventive Model. And right now we're on Ward 8, we're going up and down Minnesota Avenue. And
Ward 7.
Huh? I mean, my bad, listeners. I messed up. In Ward 7. And what's going on is that we're hearing from the community, and one of the most phrase, the biggest phrase that's being said out there, or not a phrase, but a fact, is that the children have nowhere to go after school. They said they have one recreation center, and it's like they have nowhere to go. They're out here to run around in the streets, and you see these carjackings they're for fun. You have kids who have guns that they have more bullets in it than their age, and it's like okay,
Right.
they're just running around, they're just shooting. So they're saying, man, the kids need something constructive to do. And they're the ones that's the majority of them. They're the youth are the majority of the ones who commit these crimes out here, because they don't have anything to do.
I think the other part of what was articulated in scaling safety that's important was the services that young people need. Some young people are already getting all those services. Those young people live in one part of our city that is well-resourced, where the parents could purchase their way for a young person to be in a 24/7 community center. But what you were saying, Travis, about Ward 7 and Ward 8, that's not the case. So the other thing about the safety gaps model way of thinking about it is we already do have a pretty good mental health system. It's just a mental health system that works in one part of our community, not another part. I think on the mental health piece, you could make a critique that it isn't working that well for everybody, but we have employment programs. We have housing for people when they've had an issue that relates to the law. It's different for people with means, and that is a real factor in how safety gaps exist in Washington, D.C.
You know, you said one thing that was real interesting, and we see it a lot. I mean, if we look out the window or go outside of our office building today, and we'll see mental illness. And, you know, the men and women, they're just roaming the streets. They're not getting any help. And when they get too boisterous or outlandish, the officers will come and apprehend them, and then they'll lock them up. So they're not doing anything to help the people who have mental health issues. They're locking them up, and then when they lock them up, they're doping them up.
That's right.
And then their mental health issue becomes worse. And I read that in the pamphlet as well. A man or a woman who goes to prison who has a mental health issue, they become worse.
Yep. I think one of the things that when I'm hearing you talk about what's in scaling safety and thinking about mental health, there is almost a national consensus that we have a mental health crisis and we're not responding well to it. In the report Scaling Safety, it talks about a program called Cahoots.
Right.
It's out Eugene, Oregon, right?
In Eugene, Oregon. Everyone holds it up. Now, the most important thing about this program are the elements of it and trying to imagine, well, what would that look like in D.C.? So this program model, basically, they actually recruit people that are experts at working with people in crisis. And some of the people they recruit are people that work in bars. Think about that for a second. Think about that for a second. What do you need to do in a bar that's similar, that may be similar to what you might encounter if somebody's in crisis? De-escalation. Can I help you? Can I help you without touching you? Can I help you without it turning into a fight? What resources can I apply? Most barbacks, they're not throwing people out the door. They're de-escalating the situation. I raised that about the Cahoots model because if you think about what you've experienced in D.C., is that why is the only way I can respond to a mental health crisis to call 911, call the police? If you're lucky, an ambulance will show up shortly behind them, and then the police will say, yeah, you know what, this really isn't our job, this is your job. The amount of money and time you have just spent to deal with that one person versus having a community-based program that is agile, that is able to get around the neighborhood, that knows the neighborhood, that's known in the neighborhood, that knows the treatment providers. that's sort of an attempt to fill a safety gap, which all over the country we're seeing. And Travis, what you were saying is you've seen it
Oh yeah.
every day. And do you feel safe when you see the police roll up?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Right.
Not at all.
Right. I was just thinking about the other categories that we were talking about as far as how to scale safety and close the safety gap in terms of reentry programs. So we have reentry programs here in DC, like the National Reaching Out for Returning Citizens, Voices for a Second Chance, Community Family Life Services. And what I was getting from the report is that we have these reentry programs here in Washington, D.C., but according to the report, what are we doing to close the safety gap? What are we doing to bring them to scale? And it would seem like it would be a no-brainer for funders, politicians, people of power to invest in this program. And I appreciate the report because it talks about how 600,000 prisoners are coming home every year. And then what are we doing to really provide services as far as the reentry aspect of it? So I was just wondering, why is this a difficult thing when we have data showing us that this is what people want as far as constituency is concerned, voters, taxpayers, things like that. But then at the same time, the reality is that maybe there's something else going on. Maybe there's something muddying the waters as far as why the safety gap isn't being closed, why we aren't bringing these programs as far as reentry to real scale.
Okay. So there's a couple of different responses to your question. I think we should sort of knock them off.
Okay.
Knock them off, Jason.
Yeah. Number one, we have attempted through plans to do some of what's in scaling safety in Washington, D.C. I'm thinking of two things right now that come to mind in particular. The NEAR Act, which was a piece of legislation designed to have a public health approach to violence prevention. We have had numerous reentry task forces. I believe National Reentry Network is part of RAN, which is one of you can explain what RAN is. RAN is like a coalition
For reentry organizations, yeah.
Right. So we have our RANs. We have the mayor's office on reentry. We have the Office of Victim Services and Justice Grants Administration making grants. We had the NEAR Act. We had the Gun Violence Prevention Plan that was issued by the National Center for Criminal Justice Reform at the request of the mayor 2 years ago. We have these plans. These plans have data, just like scaling safety. We haven't implemented these plans would be the short answer. That's the short answer. The longer answer to the question about, well, if we know this, like, why aren't we doing this?
Correct.
I think there's a political aspect to that question, which is we have done punishment and policing and prosecution at a grand scale in here in D.C. for a long time. We know how to fund a jail. We know how to fund MPD. We know how to have a colossal court system. All of these entities together consume about $1.6 billion in resources every year.
Right.
That includes the federal agencies that, touch people on probation or supervised release. That includes the D.C. courts, which actually are a federally funded entity. That includes the United States Attorney's Office. And then you get to the Department of Corrections, the jail, the MPD that are under D.C. government. We have invested in a system, and we're using that system. So if you want to sit down and there's only one stool, you're going to sit on it versus having multiple options for how you resolve something. We haven't built the political will to implement the models that we've already got plans around, and we haven't resourced them. That's the longer answer to your question.
I appreciate that, and that's something that we've got to. Hopefully, our listeners who are listening today can take some of this information and really speak up and speak out about what we can be doing as a community and how we can use this type of data sharing to really bring some of these policies to fruition. And it's one thing to just have a plan, but to actually fund it and implement it is a whole nother thing. And that's what we need to be doing. Actually, I agree with you, Jason.
Yeah. One last thing about this. You know, we have to love our city and push our city at the same time. These two things are not mutually exclusive.
I think it was missing love.
Yeah.
Because I mean, if you think about it, in a community, if you really love your community, then you're gonna be active in your community. Violence interrupters, people come from the outside, they actually come in and try and clean up all these plans that we have going on. Okay, if the government is coming up with these type of plans and things, okay, the people who are trying to or maybe trying to activate it and apply it, they need to come from these same communities. And you said love. That's what's going to get it done. There's not enough care. People saying, okay, let's get this type of money and put this plan together. You're going to get paid whether it gets done or not. We see this because it's still around. But if we actually love and care for our communities, we will come from outside of our homes and actually be a part of it. I mean, it was done in the past, early on in the past. But nobody wants to do anything now. Nobody wants to get their hands dirty. Don't want to put the boots to the ground and actually do what's needed for their own. If we're talking about the youth and the mentally health, they belong to somebody.
It's also important when we talk about, well, why isn't this happening even if we know what we should be doing? The love that I was sort of speaking of is also, this is not simple work. It is hard work to engage with somebody who's come out of prison or jail, who didn't have any planning while they were in the institution, to then navigate our very challenging, housing assistance process, let alone getting an apartment in D.C., getting your ID, all this stuff. Like when I think about the models that you read in the report, CAHOOTS, the reentry models, the trauma recovery centers, these are very hard jobs. The people that are in these jobs believe in what they're doing because they can see the benefit on a day-to-day basis, and they are incredibly under-resourced. Like the trauma recovery center model is a really interesting one. Most of what they do is mental health and service related, and like getting people onto the services that already exist. You have to be a navigator. You have to be a project manager. You have to have either a clipboard on your computer or the best clipboard you've ever seen. You got to be able to get back on the phone with somebody over and over again. And I'm guessing both of you have experienced this. Sometimes a person who's either coming out of prison or just been a crime victim, they need to be on the phone with somebody around a process. Sometimes our peer navigators got to get on the phone with the government agency to make sure that everything is happening. So the reason why we need to resource these approaches more is because it is incredibly hard, time-sensitive work. The only thing comparable that consumes more resources and gets worse outcomes is prison.
Right.
And jail.
Right.
Those are incredibly expensive, resource-intensive things. And we can show you they get terrible outcomes versus these other things that get great outcomes.
It's funny you say that. I was going to it is very much difficult work, but it's important work as well. And we were just talking about policies, but I was reading in the article, there are over 40,000 policies that prevent returning citizens from being successful in terms of employment. They said housing, and there was a third thing as well. But my concern with that statistic is that we're making policies not in favor of reentry. that returning citizens are not able to move forward.
Right.
So in addition to it being hard work as far as standing up programs that will close the safety gap, that will bring Kahoot programs, like you said, and other reentry programs and mental health programs and victim services programs to scale, we are making policies that we have to, confront before we can even get to the light at the end of the tunnel around these programs that will help us close the safety gap and bring scale to eliminating the crime cycle, basically. And so until we really address those policies that are making it difficult, whether it's a background check, whether it's not allowing a returning citizen to get certain type of housing, we're still having to look at data to show people what really works and what we should be doing, actually.
I want to give 2 recommended resources. On the DC Justice Lab library, there are 2 articles. One is on expungement and sealing of records, which I know you've spoken about.
Correct.
And the second one is about whether or not we should include amongst the traits for whether or not one's human rights have been violated, that are trait among the 21 traits, sexual orientation, sex, race, we should add conviction status. Those 2 articles would take some steps towards easing the reentry challenge. And I would also point to, in the article on sealing and expungement, you'll see a short video of the most recent debate around the secure DC legislation, in which our council members were agonizing over whether or not to speed up the implementation of our record sealing and expungement legislation. And it was a good discussion. I mean, basically, in that debate, our side won. Something like 8 out of 12, 8 out of 13 council members voted in favor of, speed up the implementation date of this law. Let's get criminal records off of people as soon as possible. And we're still having a discussion, as you know, about funding it.
Right.
We are having a discussion about whether or not computers and numbers attached to individuals can be merged, and whether or not the courts can work with MPD to do this as fast as possible. It's an issue of political will. I would direct people to those 2 articles, because that little video of some of the council members talking about this very issue, very illustrative. It shows what I was trying to get at earlier. There's a political dimension to why we're not funding the safety solutions at scale.
Somebody needs to stand in the gap. Safety gap we're talking about.
That's right.
A gap is just simply a breach. I mean, there's something is leaking out or allowed to get in. So these gaps need to be handled with care, concern, education, and just pretty much, as we talk about boots to the ground, it needs to be active. Need some action.
No returning citizen left behind. That's what I'm thinking. No returning citizen left behind.
Yeah, I mean,
let's close the gap.
Yeah, I mean, you just quoted something that was out of the pamphlet or the booklet. Returning citizens face 40,000 laws when they come home. Those are hurdles and hoops.
Right.
That it's almost impossible, and the recidivism rate is going to be high when you got to go through this many hoops. Is it 40,000?
Right, and then on top of that, like Mr. Jason was saying, they're not trying to, here in D.C., as we know, fund the Second Chance Amendment Act, which would help, seal and expunge records.
Yep.
Just to give an example.
And there's a very small, for all these returning citizens coming home on the IRA, the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act. A lot of them were young that went in, and they're older when they come out. We're talking about late teens, early 20s. They're coming home in their late 40s, early 50s, sometimes longer than that. but it shows that it's a very low percentage of recidivism. I think it's under 3%. So they're showing that, hey, we're ready to come back into society. We're mature. We were young and dumb back then. As it shows, our minds weren't mature. So that's why we did these type of crimes that we did. So if it shows this type of statistic that only under 3% recidivate, then why not record seal and expunge so they can work and get the type of jobs that's needed? Because men and women come home from prison, especially after a long stint, they have the discipline, they have the work ethic, and they had the drive and the passion want to work and not only work but succeed because they know they're behind.
And we need, like the title of the article itself, we need an alliance or the organization for safety and justice. We need people to come together who have heard or we've shared this information publicly on this podcast today, who want to do more with what we know as far as best practices. And whether it's the Kahoot program, whether it's victim services, whether it's mental health, or whether it's reentry, or whether it's dealing with prevention of violence, we've got to share this information and get it out there so that people can say, we know what the safety gap issue is, but now let's bring it to scale.
Mm-hmm. Any parting words, Jason? You want to give us anything?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to continue to have discussions in this town about crime rates. We're not finished with that discussion.
Mm-hmm.
I would urge anybody listening to this, I would urge my partners, the National Reentry Network, anyone in the city, don't get stuck in a discussion about whether crime rates are up or down in any given short period of time. The fact that we ended last year with a record number of homicides and carjackings up are not good things.
Right.
They are not good things. But the safety gaps that we're talking about here have been enduring for decades. And even in times where, let's say, there were only 100 homicides in all of D.C., and carjackings was a relatively well-managed problem, we still had massive safety gaps in terms of people coming out of prison without the support that they need, with crime survivors getting no support after a crime. Those gaps are the core things we need to fill. So I would always recommend to people, if you're having a discussion with someone about crime rates and very specific crimes, address it and bring it back to, well, what about filling these core safety gaps? Reentry, mental health, violence interruption and community violence prevention, and addressing crime survivors' needs.
This is the NRC Black Table Talk podcast, and we're thankful for our friend and our guest and Jason from DC Justice Lab sharing with us the crime rates, the safety gaps. And like we always say, we're signing out. We're never signing off because there's always work to be done in the community. We got boots to the ground. Y'all do good. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.